I was going to wait and see if Regina was possibly a couple minutes late, but I don't think we'd heard a confirmation or decline from her, so we can just get started right now because we've got a quorum to start the meeting. So I'll call to order this meeting of the ad hoc committee between the City Council and the Stoughton Board of Education. So we have a couple new faces here, including our presenter, Randy Stecker. So I'd like to go around the room quickly and just introduce ourselves. I'll start. My name is John Coughlin. I am a Stoughton School Board member, and I am co-chairing this committee.
I'm Nicole Wiesinger, and I'm on the City Council for District 4, and I'm co-chairing with John.
District 4 is the best district, but none of the others are any good at all.
I disagree.
Well, you're wrong.
We have Frank.
That's right.
Yeah.
I personally am a resident of District 4, and I'm Frank Sullivan, I'm the president of the school board.
And I'm Sid Borsma, I'm District 1 Council, and there's a reason why it's called District 1. That's all I can say.
This is 3 less than.
That's right. And I'm Tim Swadley, and I live in District 1, and I'm the current mayor.
I'm Laura Trotter, I'm the director of the Stoughton Chamber of Commerce.
I'm Randy Stoker. I'm Gary from BW Madison. Joshua Holt, I'm a chamber member, local realtor, and I guess I live in District 2.
My name is Matthew Griffey. I work with Kicks Unlimited Stoughton. Very interested in tonight's meeting.
Jill Patterson with Stoughton Area School Board. I live in District 3.
Kathleen Hoppy, Stoughton School Board. I'm not going to tell you where I live.
It's better.
All right.
It's better that we don't know.
My mayor is Tim. That's all you need to know.
And we are missing the one other voting member of the committee, Regina Hirsch. And so now it is school board policy to offer public comment at the beginning of all full school board meetings and all of our committee meetings now. So we have a public comment section on the agenda. If anyone is interested in kicking off our meeting with a public comment, you're more than welcome to. And if you don't want to, if you're not interested in any official public comment, I think this is a small enough group tonight that we can just open up the discussion for most of this meeting to anybody who's present. So
I do have something. We had a lunch and learn today, and I was just mentioning that at the lunch and learn I did a little discussion with people about this meeting tonight. So this is well-announced meeting with people who attended lunch and learn today. And my question was, my comment was, I personally, and I think the committee would welcome input as to especially related to our mission statement at this point, which was accepted by the school board and acknowledged by the city council, of increasing and retaining new families into Stoughton. I'm paraphrasing the mission statement. And so the question was, what would be helpful? And I talked to some people about the fact that homes that are reasonably priced for new families would be a great addition to the city. More in the range of $250,000, $275,000 homes as opposed to $400,000 homes in some of our settings. So I thought I'd bring that to the committee tonight just to say it was a little survey that I did kind of at my table. And I think it's pretty apparent that we need more housing. So it's not just school related, but it certainly is something that we as a city council should be advocating and supporting as additional housing resources for our folks in this town. So when it comes to when we look at TIFs and when we look at housing developments and support of housing, I think we need to really focus on that as one way of bringing those and retaining new families and That's my comments, and I'm sticking with them.
Thank you, Sid. I think, well, I know that part of the report that Randy will be presenting to us tonight will include thoughts about housing, so,
May I say something too?
Yeah,
Okay.
please.
At that same meeting, somebody approached me and they wanted me to pass along, knowing what we would be talking about tonight. Now, this individual, his business, he lives in, I believe, Cottage Grove, but his business touches Sun Prairie, Cottage Grove, Stoughton, and Monona that I know of, maybe more. So he has a little bit different perspective and he sees, you know, he's an outsider. And his 3 comments he wanted me to share are that all the school districts around us, it's so competitive right now for families to be drawn to a community. He says, you have to promote how good your schools are. And then he secondly said, your schools have to be good. So he's an outsider, so he didn't know what our stats were, but that also means we're not getting the word out about our school. And then the third thing he said is that as an outsider, he sees that Stoughton really focuses on our heritage, and that means old. You know, that's how it's perceived. So those were 3 comments he wanted me to share.
Thank you. I'll also be taking minutes for this meeting, so if I'm slow to respond, it's probably because I'm writing, so I apologize in advance.
Just because of what Laura just said, I actually had a couple people speak to me in the last couple weeks. One of them, a young family in Madison that want to get out into another community, and I told them about Stoughton and that we'd moved here recently, and they said, oh, are you Norwegian? I said, no, I'm not. Well, yeah, why would I want to live there if I wasn't Norwegian?
Right.
Yeah, so there is that perception.
How many, just an informal raise of hands, how many people here are Norwegian?
Aren't?
Are?
My brother just had a test, and it said that I do have a little bit of Scandinavian in me.
A little bit
Claim
of
it that,
Scandinavian?
yeah.
Okay.
I have denied it for years and years, but who can fight against a brother getting a genetic test?
We need another test. Yeah, we probably have some, but that goes back about 800 years and involves some burning monasteries.
Okay.
Not that we hold a grudge.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's, I'm excited that this work in particular, this committee work, I know that attracting young families to a city is something that is pretty interesting to anybody. And I've always found unanimous approval of that concept, just in its most raw state. And so I'm excited that when people mention that we have a committee that's specifically focusing on attracting and retaining young families to Stoughton, that the public is willing to offer thoughts and opinions, because I think that's a good sign. I think that means that people will probably respect and approve of the work that we're doing. So I'm excited. I feel like we have some momentum, and I think this is good. Is there anybody else before we move into our consent agenda?
Communication piece.
Yeah.
What are some of the pieces? I mean, maybe this will be answered. How do you communicate your mission? How do you communicate what your goal is besides just pieces of paper?
Are you asking very specifically about this committee?
Yes.
So, how familiar are those of, or you two, Matthew and Joshua, how familiar are you with the work that this committee's done up to this point?
Not very.
Just to give you a little bit of background, about a year and a half ago, the city and the city council and the school board met at a joint meeting. So there were probably about, I don't know, 15 or 20 of us there. There's typically 12 members on the city council plus the mayor, and then there's 9 members on the school board plus a superintendent. And so we all got together because there was some talk over maybe a couple years that there were definitely shared concerns that the two bodies had, or components to our operations that we could leverage if we spoke more frequently. So the two organizations met, and one theme that came out was the declining enrollment that the school district has had for a number of years. And I think we lose maybe 3%. Frank, do you know, or does anybody else know?
Sounds right.
I think we lose about 3% of our student population, and have for, I think, the past at least 5 years, but maybe more than that. And so if we continue at that rate, if we continue with that trend, eventually our district could shrink far enough that we have to close a school, or at a bare minimum, we lose funding for every student that we don't have in the district. So there was a recognition that losing students will eventually mean that our schools are losing funding and no longer able to offer as wide of a range of services to our kids. And the city council and the school district recognized that that was a big enough problem that they wanted to spin off a subcommittee that would be joined between the two bodies. So we have 3 school board members and 3 city council members that would look into and try to hopefully reverse our declining enrollment trend. And so this ad hoc committee has been formed for about a year, and in that year we have met, this is our 4th time meeting now, and in the 4 times that we have met, our past meeting, we finally settled on a mission statement to make Stoughton a community of choice that attracts and retains young families. So we wanted a mission statement that was as narrowly focused as we could get, and since the committee was formed with not a ton of direction from the Board of Education and the City Council, but the sort of theme that we were interested in decreasing declining enrollment, we felt that attracting and retaining young families was probably the declining enrollment was a symptom, and the cause was just not attracting and retaining enough young families. So we settled on that mission statement, and that's about where we are at this point. So we got a mission statement, and then we wanted to try to find some sort of concrete research or help or action that we could take to go back to the City Council and the Board of Education to inform them, or to help inform them what the causes of the problem of not attracting and retaining enough young families are. And so one of the first things that we noticed was Randy Stoker and some colleagues of his at the University of Wisconsin published a report in December of last year that was titled "Gaining and Maintaining Young People in Wisconsin Communities." Yeah. Or yeah, young adults. Sorry, yeah, it's been right up there the whole time. I apologize. But they surveyed communities all over Wisconsin and several in the Dane County, Rock County area that are of similar size to Stoughton. So we thought that would be some impartial, direct research that might be able to give us some ideas for how we could start to study things. So in terms of specific communication methods, we don't have them yet.
Okay.
I don't think that we've gotten that far to this point. So anybody else have anything they'd like to add on that summary?
There was a short piece after our last meeting in the Courier Hub. Is the link.
Yeah, I think this issue's gotten the attention of the local newspaper. So that, I think, or building a relationship with them, they've already mentioned that they'd like to continue following these meetings, but also they'd like to meet some of the committee members. They were interested in possibly having short guest columns by committee members. So that's one direct way for us to get the message out. But I think what we might find after Randy speaks tonight is that any research that we do ourselves, any sort of case studies that we kick off will involve a lot of community participation, or will have to involve a lot of community participation. So at that point, I think we'll probably find all sorts of other methods for getting the word out.
Thank you.
Some of us were contacted by the press.
Mhm.
I was one, they wanted us to respond to an email. One of the things that we did discuss last time was the fact that we wanted to make the mission statement an action statement too, that
Yes.
we really, we just don't talk about it, we don't want to talk about it, we want to do something about it at some point and try to implement some changes. And one of the things that I've noticed when I've mentioned this, and I've mentioned it to a number of people, some of my constituents, and I think there is generally, I think, a positive response for having this committee. And I think that just having the committee with a little bit of advertising on our own by telling people about it might have a really positive effect as well. So I'm looking forward to what we're able to do in the next, especially in the next year or so, 2 years.
Mhm.
We can keep it going. I think we need to do something action-wise. And one thing I want to mention is that last time, I'm a realtor in town. I looked at some things on Zillow, as a ratings, where in the school, in response to what the Zillow says about the school system itself, is that we are in most areas, both reading and math, under 50% of
Yes.
other communities. And so, and that has an effect, because right now, and it's my experience, that a lot of people who are looking for homes in an area will go to a place like Zillow or Wisconsin Homes or whatever and try to get some information from them about the school. And if they fall below 50, especially in this area, that we need to bolster those scores somehow, and not just what we say about the school, but what other sources say about the school. And you're a realtor too, and I'm sure you hear that from your constituents. When we're a realtor, we don't necessarily tell people about where the scores are, but it's my understanding that people really know where those scores are for the school. And if we're under 50, that needs to, and expect that young families to come in, we need to somehow change that score to over 50.
Well, let me respond to that a little, if I may.
Yeah.
I agree with you that I think it's important that our schools be the best they can be. I think, and I speak only for myself here, that that's not something that's particularly a good use of this committee's time to discuss, because that's a school board issue. It's our issue to make our schools better.
Agreed. Separate issues.
And we can sit here and say, yes, the schools need to be better, the schools need to be better. That's our job. And if the conclusion of this committee is, the only problem is that the schools need to be better, let's disband the committee and go home.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of other issues that we can talk about here that we as a group, as a combination of the different stakeholders here can really make some movement on.
Yes.
And that's where I'm coming from on that.
And I'm not just saying, make the school better necessarily, but, I'm interested in how those scores come through a place like Zillow.
Can I say something on that? I'm looking at Zillow right now, and it's all provided by greatschools.org, and they say this is really a starting point, that we don't incorporate a huge amount of information. So if a parent looks at Zillow and they're actually concerned, it's stated right there that, we're only looking at test scores and there may be other factors, blah, blah, so do your homework.
So my point to Frank is that not necessarily is it an issue of making the scores get better, but also maybe looking at things like, how do these places get the scores, and can we change that so we get better reporting? This goes to this whole issue of marketing.
I don't know, you'd have to check out greatschools.org, but yeah, maybe we can get back on track a little. I just have to watch the time, sorry.
Are there any other comments before we begin? Okay, so we'll move to a consent agenda, which the only thing we have on this agenda is approval of our July meeting minutes. Anybody who's interested, we have a copy of these minutes printed out. We did not get them on the school district website as a document yet, but I know they were on the city website. I would accept a motion
I'll move to
to,
approve.
all right, second? All right. Any discussion? Okay. All in favor of approving the July meeting minutes? Say aye.
Aye.
All right. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. Now I wanted to make sure that we did an update from the City Council and the Board of Education, just in case either of us had an opportunity to go back to our larger bodies. And I'll start. The school board approved the mission statement that we came up with at our last meeting. So, but that was all of the discussion that we really had from the school board.
And I, at the last council meeting, announced these meetings that we're having, the ad hoc committee, and who comprised it. But I also talked about, I mentioned the mission statement, and I talked about it. We didn't need an approval of it. I did that just for the council to know what that mission statement was and how we're proceeding.
We also, as a committee, voted Nicole in as co-chair last time. Is that something that the city council has to approve or did approve?
That was shared as the informational update that Sid gave, but we can put it on the agenda for the September 11th meeting, I think.
Yeah, we didn't take
Yeah.
a formal approval of that, but we certainly can.
I mean, that's up to the council. I only mention it in case we have to.
So the next opportunity would be our September 11th meeting, probably. We could put it on there as
We can certainly do that.
Yeah.
It will also be reflected in the minutes, which will be approved.
Okay. Any other discussion on updates from the two larger bodies? All right. Randy, would you like to introduce yourself and the presentation that you'll be giving?
I'll stand up here because John asked me to be on the record. It's a little scary, but I can do it. So I'm Randy Stoker. I am part of the faculty in the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology at UW-Madison. I also have a kind of quasi-extension appointment. Extension pays for 70% of me. And so my work is not primarily to teach classes. My work is actually community outreach and community work around the state, and particularly supporting local extension educators as well, and research projects like this. I should also mention I'm a Wisconsin native. I grew up in this small town of Mukwonago in southeast Wisconsin, and got my first 2 degrees at UW-Whitewater, and then went out and explored the world, but only as far as Minnesota and Ohio, and then came back here. So that's a little bit of the context for what I'll talk about. And this was a 2-year project that we were engaged in. There were a bunch of folks involved in it, and I just want to make sure that I recognize all of those. A bunch of UW Extension folks, the Applied Pop Lab was involved. We had a Hatch grant, which is funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, that paid for our graduate student research assistants. And all of that labor then, they actually did the bulk of the labor that produced the data that we're working with here. So we wanted to do something a little bit different, is because we were talking about this issue as something that was important around the state. And Extension actually created a team that was devoted to thinking about the challenge of engaging young people and maintaining young people across the state. And as we talked about it, so much of the talk is about the loss. And we thought, well, are there any exceptions? And so that was our standpoint, was thinking about, are there places that are exceptions to this trend? And so we started with a strengths approach, finding places that were gaining young adults rather than losing them. We also took a community approach. I don't know how many of you have looked at the reports on the loss of young people, but they're all at the county level. This county's losing this many, this county's losing. And we thought, well, people don't really move to counties. They really move to communities. And so let's start looking at the community level. The other thing is that in extension, a lot of the things that happen are things like, well, let's do a program to try and attract young adults. And then we'll do an evaluation of that program. And the evaluation turns out fine, but the community doesn't increase in young adults because it was only one program. So we thought, well, let's work backwards. So instead of doing a program and seeing what its effect is, let's look for the effects. Let's look for the effects of places that are gaining and maintaining young adults and trace backwards to the causes. And the idea was to find forms of community development in those places that might be adaptable to other places. And so we started with all 1,800 plus Wisconsin municipalities and towns. So the cities, the villages, and the towns. And we say 1,800 plus because that number actually is a moving target. It changes as towns get annexed and the populations of places change. Our actual data set is 1,880 places, but that was a snapshot in time, and it's actually less than that now. Then we got census data. The reason we got census data, and the problem with the census data is that, of course, now it's 8 years old, but we got census data because census data is the only data that you can reliably drill down to the community level. The stuff that happens in between censuses is so full of errors that it's really hard to rely on it because it's basically estimates. And so we defined young adults as 20 to 39. There's a very long explanation for why we did that, but ultimately that's what we settled on, was 20 to 39 in 5-year cohorts. And so 20 to 24, 21 to, or 25 to 29, et cetera. And we did it 1990, 2000, and 2010. Now, there were a couple of problems with doing this. So, so you get census data, and you look for the places that have more young adults. All right, what's the first place you're going to find?
University.
University towns, college towns, yeah. Does anybody know what the second place is you're going to find?
Cities?
Sadly, prison towns. And so what happened was we just ran the statistics and said, okay, what shows up? And and all the university towns show up, and all the prison towns show up. And we thought, well, okay, universities are an unrealistic community development strategy. And prisons may be both unrealistic and we may not want more of them. And so we said, how can we control for this? Well, cool enough, in the census data, you have this thing called group quarters living. Group quarters living includes both dorm rooms and prison cells. And so we could exclude all the group quarters. And then that would allow us a better measure of people who were living in regular kinds of housing and were less likely, consequently, to be people who were there temporarily. Now, the other thing we realized is that, there's like 4 Wisconsin Dells in the census data because it crosses 4 counties. And so, that was the other thing that was a problem, and we had to go through all of the villages and towns that crossed county lines and combine them together. So then, once we did all that, what we decided to do was we actually tried 3 measures. We ended up with 2. The gainers So we looked for places where the absolute number of young adults increased from 1990 to 2000 to 2010. And those we called gainers. And then we looked for maintainers, places that had a higher percentage of young adults compared to like the middle. All the places that were above what we call the median, which is the middle of the distribution, we called maintainers. Now the other thing that we looked for was places where that proportion of young adults increased from 1990 to 2000 and 2010, but guess what? There ain't none. There are about 5 small towns, basically where somebody built an extra housing development that actually showed that. But the rest of the state, while young adults were gaining in number, older adults were also gaining in number. So the proportions weren't increasing over time. So what we ended up with were the gainers and the maintainers. And here's what the map looks like. So all the green dots are the places that are both gainers and maintainers. And it's really, really like clear what's going on this map. You know, look at up north. There are no cities and there are no freeways. And where there are cities and where there are freeways, young adults are not necessarily actually clustering in the cities. All those red squares within the state line, so like La Crosse and Fond du Lac and Wausau and Milwaukee and Racine, those are all places that are not gainers and maintainers. Only the green ones are gainers and maintainers. So, you know, it's interesting that Wausau doesn't show up on the list, but communities around it show up on the list. And just in case you're interested, the median gainer in Wisconsin is actually minus 22%. So the median city or village or town actually lost 22% of its young adult population between 1990 and 2010. That's the median. So, you know, the exceptions are somewhat rare. Now, if you're wondering what the proportion of young adults is in the median place in Wisconsin, it's 24%. 24% of the population are young adults. So then, okay, well, what about Stoughton? So I dug up the numbers on Stoughton. Stoughton is actually one of those green dots. So that's the good news. Now the thing to think about in relation to that good news is, you know, your gaining score was 11.43%. So I mean, that's halfway decent. So your young adult population increased by almost 12% between 1990 and 2010. And then your maintaining score, in 1990, it was 33%. In 2000, it was a little under 30%. In 2010, it was 25%. So just above the median. And that may also be part of what you're seeing in school enrollment, is that trend may be continuing. I mean, we won't know until the next census stats come out, but clearly the proportion isn't increasing, it has been decreasing. Now another way to look at this, just in case the graph leaves you skeptical, we also did this in numbers. You know, the distance from a freeway and the distance from a city for the gainers, maintainers, and the non-gainers, maintainers. And it's just another way to show that being closer to a city and closer to a freeway is more likely to be a place that has a gaining and maintaining young adults. Now, it's one thing to like have the numbers. It's another thing to look for the explanation. Well, why? I mean, other than a freeway and being close to a city, there's probably more going on here. So one of the things we did was we divided the state up into the Workforce Development Board regions, and Then we looked for communities in each of those regions that we could do case studies with. So we ranked the top 20 gainers and the top 20 maintainers within each of those regions. And by the way, Stoughton is not in the top 20. And then we looked at what we called overlappers. So places that were in the top 20 gainers and the top 20 maintainers. And we talked to the extension folks. Regions 5 and 6 are a little weird because, I mean, any of you who, like I, grew up in Wisconsin, know that 5 and 6 really violate that up north boundary. And so we kind of divided 5 and 6 according to the up north boundary. And then, we ended up with 130 places that we were considering for case studies. And then once we drilled down, we did a lot of driving through places. We talked to a lot of extension educators, and we ended up with these places. So Delavan down in Region 1, West Bend in Region 3, Omro in Region 4, De Pere and Black Creek. And we had to learn how to say some of these places too. It is Black Creek, not Black Creek. We got corrected a couple times on that one in Region 5. Region 6 is Plover. Region 7 are only up north place, Hayward. Region 8, Somerset and New Richmond. Region 9 on Alaska. Region 10, Brooklyn. And Region 11, Evansville. So then what we did was we organized in each of those, well, when I say we, it's primarily the grad students, but with the extension educators, organized a core group in each place. So local leaders and local residents. And in some cases, those were people from local government, sometimes chambers, sometimes the churches, education leaders, and mostly young adults, but not entirely young adults. And what those core groups did was guided the research in each community. And so we had this incredible bank of questions that we could ask. And any of you who've been through, like, particularly UW-Madison, but lots of other universities and colleges, we have to go through this ethics review process for any research we do with people. And we didn't know what questions people would want to ask, so we came up with every possible question in the world so that we could get the review board to approve all of them. And that way people could choose the questions that they wanted in each community. There was lots of overlap among the questions that they chose, but they also chose some that were particular to their communities as well. Now the thing that we did with that was we did what we might call lay expert interviews. And since many of you are elected officials, you have thought about polling and the problems with polling. When you ask somebody, well, who are you going to vote for? And sometimes they'll tell you, sometimes they won't. And there's an increasing amount of error in that kind of polling. What pollsters are starting to shift to is, instead of asking people who are you going to vote for, they ask them, who do you think will win? People are much happier to give an opinion on who they think will win. And this is also, they go to the betting sites as well, and those are getting pretty accurate. And so we didn't go and find young adults and just say, well, why do you live here? We went to young adults, and in some cases some older adults, and we asked them, why do you think young adults live here? And so we didn't just get stories about an individual, we got stories about the people that person knew as well. And so, we ended up doing 12 to 24 interviews in most cases. But we actually got information about a lot more than 12 to 24 people, because people were talking about their neighbors and their friends and their acquaintances and the people that they worked with. And so here's what people said about their communities. So some of the things you've already been talking about, the obvious things, schools. People talked about the importance of schools. Now, what's interesting, however, is how they talked about schools. It wasn't necessarily about the test scores. In fact, in some places like Hayward and Delavan stand out, people were a little critical of the schools academically. But then they talked about, well, here's what's cool and unique about the school here. And so it wasn't just the academics, but it was, you know, the homecoming parade, and it was the wrestling program in Hayward, and what was really interesting was little tiny Brooklyn. Little tiny Brooklyn only has an elementary school, but people adored that school, and they adored its principal, and they talked about the school as a community space, as a space that was always welcoming. They said, everybody knows me as a parent. Even the teacher that doesn't have my child knows who I am. Because it felt small, it acted small. And the school also opened itself up for community events. And so schools are the obvious thing, but in less obvious ways. Housing was really important to people too. But it was fascinating how people talked about housing, because they talked about it differently in different places. And, you know, for example, and this actually coincided with the elementary school in Brooklyn. You know, Brooklyn was seen by the people there as a very affordable community in terms of housing. And you know, people say, well, you know, I'm living further from the city than maybe some of the closer places, but the housing's more affordable here. And then what was interesting is we heard not a lot of stories, but we did hear some stories about people who then, as they got older and their careers earned them more money, and their children got older and they had to leave the elementary school, go to middle school and high school, they moved because they could afford the more expensive house closer to the city, and then their kids were closer to school. And so what is affordable is different in different places, in the more rural places. You know, so Somerset and New Richmond, people talked about the importance of having bigger houses and bigger lots. They wanted more space in those more rural places. In the less rural places, you know, places like West Bend, you know, people were comfortable with smaller spaces. And so, you know, again, housing becomes this kind of complicated thing where every place sounded a little bit different. And then amenities were really important. Everybody talks about amenities, but what was interesting about amenities was that what people really wanted was a decent sit-down restaurant and a decent sit-down coffee house. They wanted like these gathering spots. And then we're actually kind of skeptical of having lots of shopping around. And they were kind of skeptical of the Walmarts and the big stores, because that meant traffic, and that meant strangers, and that meant that things were noisier and more congested, and started to feel less small town. Now, the less obvious reasons that people talked about. So being close to and yet away from a city. Only Hayward was a place where people didn't commute to work. Even in Hayward, however, what was interesting is that people talked about the monthly shopping trip to Duluth. And you know, they'd kind of buy what they needed kind of daily basis in Hayward, but when they really needed stuff, they just kind of created a little list, and they drive and spend a day in Duluth, and then, you know, bring a car full of stuff back with them. And that was in each of these communities. People wanted a place where you get milk and eggs and bread, but they were happy to drive. And in lots of cases, in fact, people, you know, like here, driving back from Madison, they just stop at a grocery store along the way and pick up the groceries that they needed. They didn't necessarily want all that shopping locally. And then the other thing that becomes interesting about amenities is outdoor stuff. We were amazed at how important outdoor stuff was. And it wasn't just like expensive swimming pools. It was also nice parks. It was also trails. People who talked about the local biking and hiking trails, I think it was Plover, I might be wrong about that, but in any event, they built a new housing development, and they put a hiking trail around it. And that hiking trail came up with everybody in town about how cool that was to have that available. De Pere started plowing its hiking trails in the winter, and people said, "Oh, it's so great! I can get out in the winter." And it really was all year round outdoor amenities that people were looking for and appreciating. And the other thing is this appreciation for this kind of traditional community and family feel. It was interesting how many people talked to, and okay, we're talking young adults here. They said, well, we want it to be like Mayberry. It's like, where the heck did you hear about Mayberry? And that feeling, and they also talked about, a bunch of them used the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. And they said, when my kid's acting up somewhere out there, I want somebody who's going to call that kid on the carpet and then call me. And I want to be in a place where I can trust my neighbors to do that. And so they really appreciated a place that felt that level of neighborly, where they were really getting to know each other. And the other interesting thing was family connections for people. And the kind of interesting thing about that interesting thing is young adults didn't necessarily move back to the towns that they grew up in. They moved within 20 minutes, half hour of their parents, just far enough away. And so what is interesting is they would shop the communities around where they grew up in many cases. And then, and so your Norwegian question, this question of how one thinks about themselves. One of the things that started coming up in a bunch of these communities is an appreciation for diversity among young adults. And in Delavan, that happened to be the Hispanic population and also the School for the Deaf in Delavan. And both of those things were appreciated. Now, people didn't necessarily know how to kind of cross the ethnic differences, so there was some discomfort. And at the same time, people said, that's one of the things we really like about this place. In Hayward, it was Native Americans and Native American language school that were part of the diversity that people appreciated. And then in some of the other places, that was actually one of the complaints that young adults had about being in those places, is there's no diversity here. And so that was interesting as well. Now, in two communities, so on Alaska, which is right by Eau Claire, and Plover, which is right by Stevens Point, one of the things we were surprised to find was a bunch of alumni in those communities. So in Plover, Stevens Point alumni, and in Onalaska, University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire alumni. When we were selecting communities, there was also another community near, or not Eau Claire, sorry, La Crosse, is where Onalaska is. I get that. These two-word cities, but there was another village near La Crosse where people were also saying that. We didn't study that one, but it was in our list. And so when we did a couple of site interviews with folks, they mentioned it. And so the question then becomes, well, how far does the alumni influence go? People who don't necessarily want to live in the town where they went to college, but like the area and want to live nearby. Now, two other things that we listened for in most of these places that we didn't really hear anybody talk about. One was the young adult networking and support programs that lots of places have tried. And interestingly enough, when you saw the map and you saw Wausau has worked so hard to develop a young adult networking and support program, but Wausau doesn't show up on the list. And so there's a question about the extent to which those kinds of programs work. And then the other thing is jobs development. People did not talk about the importance of local jobs. People were happy to get in their cars and drive. And many of the people that we're talking with here and learning about are young professionals. And so they're looking for a job that you're more likely to find in greater numbers in a city. And so they were looking for those things in the cities. So this leads to some tensions then. There are the quote-unquote old guard tensions, young adults who feel like, they weren't being heard by the people on the city council or the people on the county board. At the same time, they weren't interested in running themselves because, they were building their careers, they were raising their children, and they said, I don't have time for them. The other thing that starts to happen in nearly all of these places is this bedroom community idea. And when people said bedroom community, they actually didn't say that necessarily as a bad thing. It was okay for them to have that. But they also understood that it meant that there wouldn't be some things locally as a consequence. And then there was this concern about, well, the kinds of things that make a small town is that people volunteer to do all the things that you pay for in the city. And it's hard to find volunteers, when you get up at the crack of dawn, you get in your car, you drive to the city, you work 10 hours, you drive home. There's no time left to volunteer. The young adults did volunteer for things their kids did. So like, the soccer league and those kinds of things. But, otherwise it's increasingly difficult to find volunteers. In fact, Brooklyn at the time we were studying it was looking for a way to contract out its EMS service because it was having trouble maintaining volunteer service. Now the other thing for lots of places when they think about attracting young adults is they think about also trying to attract young singles. And almost universally people said this is not a place for young singles. Then there's nothing to do here was voiced frequently, and the nothing to do here was about young singles. It wasn't necessarily about young families, and so there's a real distinction there. There was also this concern about the tipping point. This turned up in Evansville and Omro in particular. Omro's a tiny little place, 1800, something like that. But it's within, a closer and closer driving distance of Oshkosh. And people say, Oshkosh is getting closer and closer, and pretty soon we're just going to be part of them. Evansville was also interesting because people had moved there for the small town feel, but enough of them had moved there, it was getting bigger. And we started thinking, ooh, is this going to tip? Is it going to be too big now? And then, trying to figure out how to maintain the minimum desired amenities. When nobody's in town during the day, how do you sustain a coffee house? And how do you sustain a restaurant? That's difficult. And, people in Brooklyn talked about, how many things had tried and started and failed. And so that's a concern when you don't have a daytime population, keeping even these kinds of businesses that people want going. So finally, some potential lessons. So it might be as important to think about the regional urban center as the community itself. Urban and rural are tied together. And people talked about, downtown Stevens Point is getting a little run down. Downtown La Crosse isn't what it used to be. And what happens if those places are seen as less desirable are then the places around them seen as less desirable. Attempting to attract young singles may be difficult. You may need to think in terms of a minimum set of local amenities, outdoor spaces, cafes, restaurants. Housing needs to be appropriately affordable, and again, that's going to vary a lot from place to place. And schools and teachers may need extra special care. And again, not just for the academics, but to create this kind of welcoming community feel culture. And then too much emphasis on growth may not be a good thing, because the people who are attracted to the smallness of a place may not be attracted when it gets too big for them.
Beloit, what does that look like?
We didn't study Beloit. I don't think it should, because we only did the number of places on those. It's all we had capacity to do. And I don't think it shows up on the gaining and maintaining list, but I'd have to check to make sure. I know Beloit a little bit just by being around the state. And economically, it's in tough shape. So, the whole Janesville-Beloit area is in tough shape. And so again, what I'd look at is I'd look at the communities around it.
Mm.
And in fact,
That's surprising, because Beloit is, the owner of ABC has put a lot of money back into Beloit, a ton of money.
yeah, though again, development may not be, when you go into Brooklyn, you look at it and go, there's nothing here.
Right.
And yet, it's still one of those places.
And Brooklyn just upgraded their school.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, it's interesting. All of the places we studied, we didn't choose them this way. We're actually just looking for a diversity of places. But the places that we chose, we found out all since there was one between 1990 and 2000, and then the rest between 2000 and 2010, all had successful school referenda. But yeah, you can see the kind of blank spot down at the bottom of the state where Beloit would be.
right.
So yeah, there isn't even an effect of the urban center there.
Okay, sorry, thank you.
So, what can you all do with this stuff? Well, one of the things you can do is compare your housing, schools, parks and trails, and more to other communities around you, and see, how expensive is their housing? How do people talk about their schools? What kind of parks and trails do they have? We also, in the report, have this do-it-yourself research guide, and it doesn't have to be totally do-it-yourself. People like me can consult with you, and by consult, you're already prepaid by your tax dollars, actually by my tax dollars too. So, I'm available to help you do this. But it's a fairly simple process, and we've done it for all the communities that we study. And so you organize a core group, you identify the issue or problem, phrase it as a question. You've kind of already done that. Ask for help, get some initial data, do some background research. Think about the kind of resources you'll need. Think about whether you want to do interviews or surveys. Think about the ethics of the research. How will you protect people's information, and how will you use this in ways that will contribute to bringing people together. Dig into, make sense of the data, share the results, put your work into action, and celebrate and reflect, which is interestingly one of the most important parts when you're doing it in a community. So I'll stop there, and you all can talk about this.
Yeah, first, Any questions for Randy?
Yes, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay, then we can move on to discussion. Thank you very much, Randy. So,
Actually, I have a question.
yeah, please, Frank.
So you had talked before about that sort of idea of, I wrote it down as Mayberry-ness, but I think you expressed it differently. When people are looking at a community from the outside, how do they assess the Mayberry-ness of the community?
You know, people talk to other people, or they knew somebody who knew somebody in lots of cases. And, you know, the question about schools, that it's like, yeah, where do people and how do people get information about schools? They asked people about the schools. So it was interesting how much like more they were looking for than what they could get from a website.
Right.
And that's also this issue of, you know, like when people were shopping around because their family lived here, so they're looking at all the communities around. And, you know, the networks, it's interesting how quickly people can find somebody and get to a network. And people visit as well. And in some cases, what happens, well, actually in lots of cases, what happens is people this actually came up here as well, somebody from Madison thinking about moving out, you know, young singles in the city, they find someone, they connect with each other, and then somebody gets pregnant, and they go, wow, do we really want to live in this small apartment? And they start looking, but their jobs are in the city, and so, you know, they start doing day trips, driving out to places around the city. We talked to so many people who started in cities and then moved.
Can I follow up with you real quick? I'm sorry. So when we're talking about this idea of Mayberry, what are people looking at? I mean, is that trees? I mean, I think of Mayberry, I think of my grandmother for one thing. But, you know, I think of this sort of very rural, tree-lined streets and Floyd the Barber and all that sort of stuff. What are the elements? What do people see in a community that triggers that?
Places that feel safe. And interestingly, it's not so much about the statistics, but it's about feeling safe. It's about a sense of quiet, which is the concern with the big box stores, is that it brings traffic and noise. A sense of calm, which is actually why they don't mind the bedroom community thing, because those players, especially if there might be a parent who's staying at home more, those places are really calm during the day. And then this sense of village parenting that I mentioned, where people felt like, yeah, you know, if my child is out there, there are other adults I trust watching out for that child.
Okay, and does that mean that, how does somebody sort of figure that out when they're coming in looking at a community? Is it that they know people who are there? What checks that box for them?
Frank?
Yeah.
You know, we just moved here 2 years ago.
Yeah.
We went through this whole process, leaving Madison, coming here, and we didn't know anybody in Stoughton. We visited pretty much all the communities, Wanakee and Oregon and all, you know, all of them. And we actually would go in the diner and talk to people, tell them we were thinking about moving here and see how they responded. But we also talked to kids with our own kid there, so it didn't look creepy, but to ask what they thought of their schools and stuff, and just heard glowing things from these kids. And that really was a big factor. There wasn't a huge price differential in housing from here to Oregon or a couple other places, but it was that sense that everybody was open and willing to talk about things, and we did see a lot more diversity in Stoughton than we did other places, and that was important for us, so right on.
Okay. Yeah, what she said.
There's been some research by the National Association of Realtors, and the general statement on that is what people are looking for is a place that they can afford, because that's the housing part of it. Then they're looking for a safe community and a good place to raise children, to include all those amenities you're talking about, but including schools. So, and that is across the board. I mean, they're just a safe place, a place to raise kids, and part of that is the school. And that's their research. So when we get trained as realtors, those are the things that we emphasize as realtors. This is a wonderful, safe place, and it's got great schools, and it's a great place to raise family, and you can feel like you're especially this Mayberry thing of being safe in your community. And that's the appeal of small towns, I think, to some extent, because, you know, there are some people who brag about being able to keep their doors unlocked, you know, in some of the small communities. But very that safety feeling of you know, I'm safe here and my kids are safe as well. Well, more of a kind of part of the discussion, but I was going to ask about safety, but he beat me to the punch. So.
Well, yeah, and it is interesting that for us, I mean, we didn't look at any statistics on crime for any of these places, and I honestly don't know if the people that we interviewed looked at statistics on crime, because it wasn't about the statistics, it was about how people felt. It was about the indicators of safety, which is that when I walk down the street, I know all these people. There aren't strange cars. People are driving slowly. You know, there's nothing big in the news. Those seem to be, so it was this feeling and perception more than statistics.
But to press you on that a little bit, that's for the people who are already in the community.
Yes,
And that seems to me to be a different question.
it might be.
Yeah, so why do I stay? I stay because I know people, I stay because I feel safe here. You know, there's Jim, Jim's a great guy, you know, there's Susie, you know, Susie will send my kid back when he's, you know, tearing up her begonias or whatever his deal is this week. And those are all things that it seems to me you would get when you're asking questions of people in Omro about Omro. But if the question is why would people come to Omro, does that answer that?
Well, but they would do what you did, and to some extent actually what we did. They'll probably go out and do some quote unquote interviews. And you know, when we chose these communities too, well, when we got down to 30 communities, we all drove all over the state, and we basically spent like, I don't know, an hour, 2 hours in each community. We'd stop at the local diner, the local coffee shop or whatever, and you know, and if the wait staff wasn't busy, we'd engage them in a conversation. We'd stop at the local library, because local librarians, man, they know everything. And we'd chat with the local librarian for a while and ask them about the place. And you know, and people will readily volunteer their perceptions of a place. And just driving through. I mean, I did that when I came down here today because I didn't trust the GPS, so I got here like half an hour early. So I drove around, you know, what's the place look like? What's going on? And, you know, how many people are out? What's traffic like? Drove by the elementary school. What's that look like? And something I can imagine lots of people doing.
Interestingly, the Stoughton Chamber of Commerce gets lots of questions about relocating, but they're from elderly people. I don't think that the younger generations are looking at the Chamber of Commerce as a 411 like the elder generation does. But I get a lot of questions from elderly people who are looking to relocate to this area. But I'm not getting it from younger people. But like I said, I think it's because
it's
older people kind of think of the chamber as a community resource, and I don't think that young people do.
well, yeah, after we did online research, we then called the schools that asked if we could get a tour, and, oh, yeah, of course. So,
Laura, do you guys have,
Relocation materials?
yeah, prepared for young adults?
Yep, no, not anything specifically for
Oh, okay.
a generation or not generation. You know, we don't
Okay.
have them geared towards elderly or anything. We share our community information, which includes our community guide that the chamber puts out. We recently got a little insert in Business Magazine that the focus was why it's great to live in Stoughton. And so we always include a copy of that. And then depending on what they've asked for, because they'll say, I want information about the parks, or I want information about schools, or something like that, then we'll just grab what we have if they ask for more information.
Okay.
We always include the Opera House schedule and Liv Strisa, you know, the things that
Yeah.
are kind of our shining tickets.
Yeah, absolutely.
oh, sorry. I mean, I never see anybody in, and I'm not gonna try to pronounce it, but, we tried to take our kids there a year ago, and we left really quickly because the volunteers there made it very clear that they had to be with us at all times, that there was no photography and no touching, and it was like, I felt chastised as an adult, so we turned around and walked out.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then the Opera House, I think it's really cool, it's there, and it's a historical thing, but it wasn't really our kind of music, so it's cool that it's there, but that wouldn't, I just think there's like a difference, and I don't know at what age it changes, but it probably has to do with if you have kids at home or kids still in school, you look at things differently than you do later on. Yeah?
It's entirely possible, because we heard, you know, again, the difference in stories that we heard in Brooklyn, which only had the elementary school, compared to some of the other places.
I have a daughter with some very young children, and she loves with her young children to go to children's museums. And that's just something that she loves to do. And so she'll go to any one of these communities with her kids and Stoughton doesn't have one, but and she goes around, and it's within driving distance for the various children's museums. That's sort of one thing that she sort of hangs on to that's one of the ways she judges communities, actually, as to whether or not they have a decent, you know, children's museum, something for her kids that she could regularly do.
Yeah, and that's
It doesn't have anything to do with safety, but certainly has to do with, you know, what's appealing to not just her as a young adult, but what's appealing to her child.
Yeah, and this question of what do people want locally, and what are they happy to drive to? And, you know, that's going to vary from place to place as well. So, you know, you may think that you need a whatever, but if you talk to people, they say, no, we'll just drive to the one in this other place. And so that's, you know, interesting kind of development question.
The same thing about pools, you know, like swimming pools in the summertime. Just my family likes swimming pools. You know, they love to take their kids to swimming pools. And that's like city pools.
Yeah, and those showed up a lot too, as a popular thing. And not necessarily the concrete ones, also the natural ones were popular with folks.
I'm just wondering, most of these communities were pretty small, and you've mentioned a lot that people were comfortable, or young adults seemed comfortable commuting to work. Was pretty much all of the commuting they did by their own personal vehicles? Were there any communities that you guys surveyed that had any sort of alternative transportation options or public transportation options to get into the commercial centers where people would work?
Yeah, you know, I was hoping we'd hear that. And especially so Evansville has a van that goes to Madison.
Oh, okay.
Delavan also has a van service to the rail line, I think,
Okay.
and maybe even more than that. And I was hoping, and then, you know, the Twin Cities, oh my goodness, Somerset and New Richmond, it's like everybody get on the freeway. And I know there are buses coming way out from the Twin Cities, but they didn't show up in the interviews, and I was disappointed that they didn't show up in the interviews. Now, I mean, you know, it's also possible we could have missed something, but we did a decent job of finding enough people, and I would have thought that, because in many cases, it didn't come up at all. So one person would have said, well, okay, well, that could represent more, but yeah, when we didn't hear it, I was surprised.
Okay.
But, you know, this is also a period, you know, when, you know, because this was over a year ago now. I mean, so gas was still like really affordable, and the interesting question would be whether that changes as the price of gas changes.
Well, I'm also wondering how many of those services are built up to a point where a decent portion of a community can use them anyways. Wisconsin doesn't seem to be a state that has serious public transportation compared to other states. But are there more questions directly for the research and their findings? Because the next item on our list is steps towards studying Stoughton. I had thought that it would be useful for us, as long as Randy is able to be here tonight, to talk about how we could start to characterize Stoughton and assess Stoughton in comparison to other communities in our area. And so I was thinking that we could just open up a discussion to some of the more actionable items that this committee could, or that could come out of this committee. But if there are more questions directly about the research, then we can.
Well, this is kind of segue. I mean, the first thing he has on there is organize a core group. Do you consider this the core group, or is it something other than this group?
You would be a better judge of that than I, and the ways that I would encourage you to think about it is people who are well connected in different kinds of ways to young adults in the community. So if all of you, you all know each other and all your friends are the same, then you wouldn't be a good core group. But if each of you has kind of like a little bit different network, then you could be a very good core group.
And just to follow up on that, what about if we would have a community forum or something where people could get together and just sort of talk about it? We've done that for some things in Stoughton, like one of them is actually for our 1892 building right over here. You know, what do you want to see? What the 1892 building, that kind of thing, and having people just voluntarily come to a well-publicized meeting that says, what's your ideas about how we could get more people in or retain people, young people, and maybe target it to a younger population even. I don't know.
Yeah,
Would that
sorry.
be helpful, or I don't know.
I was just going to add to that I've only been attending Stoughton government-sponsored functions for 2 to 2.5 years, but for the entire time that I've gone, there are almost no people in the age bracket that you guys studied represented in the communities who show up to our public forums. So if there are strategies that you guys found for getting the young people away from the busyness of the things that they're doing with their families
Can we hear
and
how
careers.
these guys?
Yeah,
I'm so happy
yeah.
to see them, and how did you guys know about this? And,
Chamber lunch and learn today.
okay.
That's how I
Oh,
heard.
that's right, you're a realtor also?
Yep.
Are you?
No, I'm
No.
not a realtor. No, I'm a
How did
martial
you-
arts instructor.
Yeah, so how did you hear about this and decide to come?
So I heard it at the Lunch and Learn as well. I actually held the Lunch and Learn.
Okay, cool.
So we held it, and with my career, I see the declining school a factor in my future.
Sure.
with my children, I need to make sure that my life is
Mhm.
good to go, and if there's something I can do as an individual, I'm gonna do it. You know, I wanna make sure that the staff members that I employ will be able to continue to pass on the martial arts, and as well as hopefully encourage young individuals to be positive role models and leaders in their community. So if I have to do that, well, if I want them to do that, I have to be the individual going out there and doing the things.
And you also recently partnered with the school district staff to offer a discount?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we did
Thank
that.
you.
Oh, no worries.
Yeah.
33% off for all the staff members in the SASD community school, as well as we just started a program. Oh, I'm super excited about this one. We started a program in the Sand Hill Community School where I will be able to work with individuals that need economic learning skills, so that way we can help provide those individuals with a chance to be a positive role model and a stronger individual and feel like they're welcomed in Sand Hill.
Love it. We gotta duplicate you. Spread it out a little.
If only.
So, you know, this question of, you know, how to get people to show up and what to ask them. What we did in these communities was we asked the core group to recommend people for us to talk to. And in some cases, they encouraged us or allowed us to say who referred us. And so, you know, we could email someone or call someone up on the phone and say, well, you know, so-and-so said you'd be great to talk to about this. And I mean, that is the hardest part, is the kind of one-to-one invite, because that's always the thing that works best to get people. And people normally, when they're busy, don't show up for a flyer or a mass email. They'll show up because some individual invited them. And sometimes they'll just show up out of guilt because of that, but they'll show up, and that's all that really matters. And, you know, then, you know, the other question I think is, at what point do you move to, like, ideas about what to do? And that, to me, is usually like the last step. And the first step is, well, what's the actual situation here? And to get a sense of the situation, and then once you get the sense of the situation and the diversity of people's experiences, then you can feed that back into the community, and people can say, oh, well, there's a bunch of people who think this, so here's an idea based on that. And you can think about it that way.
Did social media come up at all in this study? I know one thing, and I haven't heard other people complain about this, but on Facebook, there's a Stoughton neighborhood group. The most negative, that people just pile on. It's like one person says, yeah, I didn't think of it that way, but now I'm angry. And
There's a coyote coming.
I know I read in your report that people's perceptions of schools matter. And I feel like when people are piling on each other's experiences, I don't know exactly how to counteract that, but I see it as a negative factor. And I would love to find a way to encourage people to maybe not respond to every single thing. And, you know, I know that's a societal problem, but was that anything that came up, or?
Well, that's why we ask the question, basically. I mean, we asked it in like a couple dozen different ways. But the question we asked was, why do young adults come here and stay here? So the question wasn't phrased, you know, what would you change, what don't you like?
Yeah.
But it was phrased in a positive way, so we could find out what it was. Now, we also asked eventually, what would you change? but we didn't start there.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, you didn't mention anything about churches, or you didn't mention anything about bars in this thing. In this discussion. Although I know that in the study that I read, it was that Hayward, there was a request that there be more bars in Hayward.
Yes, yes.
But in terms of churches, does that make any difference? Or did you get anything about churches? But we got plenty of churches and we got plenty of bars. So, those should be,
Yeah, I mean, it didn't come up as a crucial thing, churches. And interestingly enough, bars came up in 3 different ways. One way that bars came up in Hayward was entertainment. Another way that bars came up, actually also in Hayward, was as a problem. The third way that bars came up, interestingly enough, was as community spaces. And there was a very beloved bar in Delavan that burned down. And we heard that story multiple times because people said, that's where me and all my friends used to go. And so, I mean, it's interesting, those 3 ways of thinking about bars. And, I mean, yeah, people talked about churches as one of the places where they would volunteer or do things with their kids, but not necessarily as a selling point for why they moved there.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm good.
I have a question.
How about, go
If
ahead.
you don't.
I always have questions, but go ahead.
So you did this research, and I would assume that you found similarities between these places that were successful. Based on your knowledge of all of that, and knowing that what our goal is to attract and maintain young families, would you have feelings about whether it would be more efficient for us to say, these places did all of these things and that's what they have in common? Where does Stoughton stack up against doing those, like as far as doing those things, and find out where the deficits are and move forward from there, versus going back and saying, why do you think young people move to or stay in Stoughton?
It's something that you would probably need to have more discussion about, and I'd be happy to have more discussion with you about it. I mean, there are some things that you might want to collect. I mean, for example, you might want to collect information on your housing prices here and then compare those to other communities. I mean, that's something that you might be able to do fairly quickly. One of the things we learned in De Pere was, I mean, people were having a lot of concerns about housing prices because it had become so popular that it had gone through the roof. People were getting priced out of the market. And so now people were moving to places around De Pere. And so there are some things that you may want to collect, but you also want to know, well, what's people's preference for housing here? Because these places were also different from each other as well.
I think I would also imagine that knowing the median for like jobs and things of that nature as well would be also important. So like I know like Stoughton Trailers, they have 150 employees at this moment, or 130. And I still thinking they need 150 more people, if I'm understanding that correctly. Anyone, Vix, correct me?
I think your number is that they have about 150 job openings, but I think you're wrong about how many they already employ. It's much higher than just 150.
Okay. Well, I could have been mistaken on that one. Thank you for the correction on that. There's 150 jobs still there waiting to be employed with. Is there a median in that? We want individuals to come here. We want individuals to work here. We want individuals to live here, and how can they live here if they don't have that correct job to pay for said house? That was my thing. When I tried moving here, I looked, and I did everything I could to make it happen. There was just no way that I could afford a $250,000 house. I'm an instructor that makes maybe under $40,000 a year, maybe 35 if I'm lucky. There's just no way that I could afford that. I mean, even if I had mom and dad sitting there to help me every single night, which I don't, I work for my things, there's just no way I would be able to make that happen. I mean, I don't want to be house broke.
Right.
I want to live a life. And with me being young and connecting a little bit to the individuals that we work with, they are more focused on how can they improve the world, but they can't improve the world if they can't, have a place to stay and be able to make it happen. Right. So if we want young families, how do we find that shift, or how do we find that balance where, yes, here's this, here's that, this is why you should do this, even though it's a little bit out of your price range, this is why you should live here.
Yeah, and that jobs thing is, again, jobs didn't show up as a draw in many cases because of exactly what you've described, that the local jobs didn't fit the kinds of income that people wanted and needed. And so they drove into the city to find the kinds of jobs that did have that kind of income and that kind of career ladder for a number of them as well.
Yeah, so I mean, that was my deciding factor. It was like, no way, I just can't. Maybe when I own the business and things of that nature, maybe, but then again, it's just another deciding factor for me. So, just sorry.
So, we've talked a bit about, or it sounds, Randy, like you might suggest that we begin studying Stoughton and getting a strong understanding of what our community is before we start to compare our community to all of the others around us. Do you think that's a fair summary of a worthwhile process for us?
I think that the communities we did the case studies on, when we presented what we learned back to them, they found it quite useful. AMRO, in fact, has taken that and moved on with library planning, adapting the process that we did. Folks at the Stoughton Chamber have used that to develop some of their community, or in Brooklyn, used that to develop some of their community promotion materials. A couple other places have used it. And so that this process of kind of learning about yourselves, it seems to be useful in other places.
Didn't you say that you had there's something laid out in your documents of how to look at ourselves as a community, or?
Yes,
Yeah.
so one of the appendices, and this is basically the outline for that appendix on the website, has that. And those are just like things that you could click on, and then there's an explanation for each step.
Okay.
So would you suggest that as a homework assignment, this is something each one of us would go in and then bring something back to the next meeting? Or is it something that we would do in the course of the meeting where we would just put it up on the screen and figure out how to get through the list here, establish the core group, and then, go down the list?
Yeah, this is not a lot of reading, so I mean, it's something that I imagine you could all kind of squeeze in between meetings and then come back and talk about. The other thing that I can do, if you're interested, is get you the master list of all the questions that the core groups selected from, if you'd like that as well. And, and then, I'd be happy to chat with you again as well about that process.
If we were to partner with Extension to do a study, would if we did interviews instead of surveys, would that be something that you would have staff to conduct those, or is that something we would provide?
The time that would be involved is probably something that you would need to do.
Okay.
But again, we did 12 to 24 interviews in most communities. So, if everybody did 2 here, you'd have a lot of information. And you could also spend time at a meeting doing practice interviews on each other, just to get a comfort level with it too.
What would the main 3 questions be?
I can, like I said, I can
Oh,
send
you
the
just want
master
something,
list,
okay.
and you can choose
Decide.
then what you think the most
Sorry.
important questions are.
So maybe that's something we could do in between meetings, and then at the next meeting, we can try to narrow down that list to make it what we want here.
To some extent, I think all of us think we kind of know what we need already. At least I do. Because I have some definite opinions about what I think Stoughton could do to improve and get and retain younger people. I think a community survey would be good, but then the question is whether we can use it or how we use it. It's something that this committee has to look at, because I think if we compile what we think should happen with Stoughton, we might all have pretty similar ideas to what a group would say to us too.
But isn't that the idea, that we're not just assuming we know what's best, we want to go out and...
I know that is the case, but
Sid, I think
a lot of us do have some definite opinions about.
Yeah, opinions, I would agree, we all have opinions.
Right, and Sid, I think they surveyed people between 20 and 39, right?
Yeah, so we'd have to
Most
talk
of
to our
us in this
kids.
room don't match that.
Right,
Right.
I'm not
Including you, Sid.
I'm not saying
You
we
have to
shouldn't
send
do
your
it.
daughter to the
I'm
next
saying,
meeting.
I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that, a lot of us have ideas, so.
We do, but I think if we want to gain and maintain the young generation, we actually have to go out and talk to the
I
young
understand.
generation.
Here's a situation I have, Regina, is that I've been involved in some of these surveys. And so what you do is you take a survey, you look at it, you do that, and then, I mentioned this last time, then there's no action, all of a sudden it just sort of sits there. And that's a concern that I have every time I go and start into some survey like this, because it can end up on a shelf and nothing happens, and that's the
Well,
concern.
then that's up to this group. If
Yeah.
nothing happens because we put all this time and energy into getting interviews, and I don't think it's surveys, it's interviews, that's on us.
Mm-hmm.
not
And I-
on-
Yeah, and let me say this for the board. This is the single biggest question facing the school district. This is an issue that directly impacts the quality of the services that we will provide for the next generation. And I'm not kidding when I say for a generation. And this is not something where we're gonna, do a survey and shelve it. We're gonna do something. We are going to do everything that is in our power to improve the quality of the schools, to make the schools more marketable. But the reason that we're here with you all is because we recognize this is not a school district issue, this is a community issue. And we will act. We are not going to, I can't speak for what people have done or not done in the past. I know where I am, I know when I am on this board, I know what I intend to do. And I will speak in general terms, but we are going to do something, and we are going to do it hard, whatever that may be.
I'm saying this as much as possible to just caution that we don't, if we do a big project, that we don't shove it. That's all I'm.
No,
Yeah.
I'm right there with you, Sid.
Yeah, and I believe that shelving any work this committee does is also not up to the committee so much. If we go out and we gather information and we find some way to impartially and less emotionally characterize Stoughton and provide actionable advice to the two bodies that formed this ad hoc committee, it is then up to those two bodies to act on that information, and the actions of those two bodies will speak to the priorities of the constituents that they represent. So I also I'd like to echo what Frank said, that the school district recognizes that this is a community issue, and the city recognizes that this is a whole community-wide issue. And with it being a whole community-wide issue, I think that there are a lot of people we need to educate about this, or educate about the Stoughton School District has shrinking enrollment. We may not, that is likely because we're not attracting and maintaining young families at the rate that we need to maintain enrollment, and then to fix that, there might need to be actionable policies that the city council and that the Board of Education adopt, and we're all elected officials, so any policies that we enact, we have to have reasonable explanations for. And I do think that supporting those policies with the earnest work of a committee that clearly did homework and compiled some sort of information that we can report and present will hopefully give us the backing that we need to maintain the support of all of our constituencies. Because my worry is that in the past, when we've talked about issues like this, everybody wants to fix it. But if we all come, if we bring 12 city council members and 9 school board members all together and throw around some ideas, I don't know how we can honestly filter down those ideas to the most likely ones for success and convince the community members that are all electing us that we've actually found all of those, or all of the best ideas. So I do assume that there will be a large portion of community outreach and communication and education that goes along with any recommendations that this ad hoc committee might generate within the next year.
I think this has been a problem for quite a few years. This is not something new that our community's been struggling with, but we have failed to address it for years now. And I think conducting a study with interviews instead of surveys, because the city's already just recently sent out more surveys, so I think sending out another survey would not yield the results we need, but interviews I think would be valuable. It would broaden our network, because everybody's ideas here are really valuable and important, but we are all just individual people, and we are not completely representative of this community, nor the young families in this community. And so I think having interviews would be valuable and would help us elicit some more information. But I also think partnering with Extension to do it is critical, because we need to be kept on task. Like, we are approaching 9 o'clock now, and I think we have struggled to kind of maintain focus as a group, and I think we have a potential to continue this work for another year, another 18 months, and not yield results. So I think having a partnership with Extension would help us make our goals, set targets, and set a timeline, and have actionable items that we can then act on. Because I think we all agree, kind of know what needs to be done, but we need to move forward at this point.
I think we need more realties steering people into this community. I have two children, and because I'm a realtor, 2 young families have moved into Stoughton. I'm kidding in a way.
Should have more kids.
If I had more kids, more would move into Stoughton because grandma is there for this next generation. So, but I think that, I think you're right. I just don't want I don't want this committee to do a whole lot of work and then not have some action that goes along with it. We need to be able to follow through to not just a study, but some way to actually get some change.
I hope that all of us here tonight can agree that we are only interested in serving on this committee to generate actionable items that the city council and the school board can use to attract and retain more young families. Do we have a unanimous agreement there?
So how can we keep these gentlemen engaged in this process and others that might want to join us?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just curious what your guys' takeaway is from being a part of this meeting tonight and in any capacity. What has this experience been like? Do you have thoughts or concerns, suggestions?
You.
Keep in mind, this is a public meeting.
One of the things that I really like about it is that you're actually discussing critical points. You're trying to find an action step towards it. One of the things that I keep hearing, John?
Yeah.
Is communication. And with my system or with the school that I organize and run, the biggest thing that I always focus on is communication with the purpose of family communication. We're always focused on how we can improve the family life and the feeling of that family. So, I mean, a big thing that I could see from an outsider's point of view would be connecting the school board with the city council and then promoting that you are trying to do something. Communicate that you are trying to build that family feeling, that you are trying to do these things, and you should be promoting them not only just amongst yourselves, but you should be throwing it on your Facebook pages. I know it sounds crazy, Facebook, well, what's that gonna do? But it's a share thing, then all of a sudden, you start commenting on his. It sounded like you two had some fun conversations. So it'd be a great conversation way to keep other people involved with it, but making sure that we keep it in a positive light rather than in that negative aspect. Then on top of that, reviewing review your schools. I looked at all the things today with all the different locations, all the different community schools that we have here. One of them had 19 reviews online, and I was like, wow, that's pretty awesome. One of them was a 2-star, left a very nasty, unfun message, which is fine. But then again, I look at all the other schools, 2 reviews, 1 review. This is Google. We're all in Google. Every day we research all these individuals. Why don't we start there? Why can't we review our schools and say how much of a positive light they are? Then on top of that, go in, yes, it takes work, go in and share them. Share your positive remarks on how awesome Stoughton is, how awesome SASD is, how cool and innovative they are. Sorry, but that's what I've seen, some good conversations. Just pair up and just start going with it. I'd like to be a part of that. That's what I would like to be.
And please don't apologize for sharing your opinions. We're
Good.
asking for them, and
It's
we
all good.
value your input, so, yeah.
I hope so.
I
It's
got
fun.
what you said, but I forgot what the question was.
Just
What was
curious, what your experience has been like at this meeting, whether that's specific to the way that this committee is functioning, or specific to any other aspect of the local government, regardless of how connected you are, or to this issue specifically.
Well, I would say, obviously, I'm sure a lot of people, personal connection with having a child in school now, so she's going into 1st grade, so obviously my interest in the schools has been, increased since that happened, and then also having the honor of being part of the Leadership Stoughton group last year. really kind of renewed, my focus on learning more about this community that I've lived in for so many years and the schools. And as soon as I heard about this meeting today, I made a point to clear a spot on my calendar so I could be here, because this is something that I know is vital to the community, and just on a personal level, I want to do anything I can to help kind of turn around this issue that Stoughton's having. So, if it's participating in these meetings and helping with whatever I can do, then I'm all on board to do what I can. I can speak to like what Sid does. I mean, I think we're out there in our profession promoting Stoughton a lot, and there's a lot that we have to overcome in terms of the reputation Stoughton has, but, we're willing to be here and actually, do the work needed to.
I harken back to some of my days when I was doing even more business, and I remember that I felt like part of my role was to actually sell people who, especially I was showing houses to from outside, sell the community to them, because it could sell my home, it could sell that home that I'm showing them in that community. So I'd do a little route to the chamber, and I'd go a route part of it would be to the library, and I'd go to the opera house, and I'd go upstairs and I'd show them the opera house, and I think that those are the kind of things that community members can do, no matter what their role is, I think, in a community. And that's really selling the community for people to come in. Because I think some of the people that I did that with actually bought homes. And if they didn't get that sort of TLC when we were doing that they may have picked a different community. I think it makes a difference as to how the community sells itself. And I think it makes a difference how the school sells itself. And I think the chamber can't sell itself. But, I think those kind of, it's the chamber can sell it, the city council can't. But, there's a lot of things that we can do, I think, to encourage young families. And, if there's not a decent house available in your price range, maybe to look for a house that might be decent, or develop, work with developers that develop some decent, some $150,000, $200,000 homes, who knows? But it's a big task, but I'm up for it. I'd just like to see it happen at some point, because we can't keep it declining.
Are there any, I would like to get toward our, or move into our meeting closing and figure out some action items to assign, schedule another meeting and adjourn, since it is 8:55 right now. And I appreciate everybody's time tonight. Matthew, Joshua, thank you guys for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, this is great. If you guys are interested in continuing to be connected to the work specifically that this committee does, but probably other aspects of local government initiatives, I'll take like your email addresses or something. Oh, you got them right there? All right, perfect.
When is our next meeting in September, by the way?
We have not scheduled one. So I was looking, we did a month in between this one and the last one. Does another month sound okay for people? That would bring us to September 24th.
I would really press for that.
Yeah, I think that's good.
I think we got a lot of work to do, and the more time we leave between meetings, the more momentum we're gonna lose.
I agree. If I will tentatively schedule September 24th as our next meeting date, I will make sure that we send out an invite sooner than we did last time. I'll try to get that out by the end of this week. And if people seem to have scheduling conflicts, we will find another date that is somewhere around another month from now.
24th at 7.
24th at 7. Yes.
September 24th.
And you're gonna try to send out the questions ahead of time so we can
Yep.
do some homework?
Yeah,
In
so
fact,
some,
thank you. They are in Appendix B on the
Oh, okay.
website.
Oh, they're
So
already there.
your reading assignment can be Appendix B and Appendix C.
Okay.
And whatever
So-
else you wanna read.
Will
Yeah.
there be a quiz?
There might be.
Good.
The two action items that I had for myself on here were to get that question list and send out the do-it-yourself guide, but I will make sure that I send everybody, in addition to the meeting minutes and the next meeting invitation, I will send out a link to all of that other information so that people have it directly. Nicole, what were you gonna suggest?
I have a call in to Mindy, and she was out of the office through this week, so I should hear back next week, but I
Okay.
can come back with more information about the possibility of
Starting up a partnership?
something with extension.
That would be great. Another thing that I would like to get to, that we didn't talk about in this meeting, but we talked about getting interviews and getting sort of the feeling of our young adult constituents, for why they live here and why they think other people have moved here. But I'm also interested in finding some updated statistics on Stoughton. Randy was able to provide us with two of their metrics from the 2010 census, but I'm wondering if the city has, if our city planning department has.
We
any
have a
sort of-
couple items, which actually coincidentally I sent out to Sharon today.
Oh, okay.
We updated our comprehensive plan in the last year, and there was also a study that was a joint study, we call it a FUTA study, that was done last year, and there's some data in there, but they're both pretty large documents.
Okay.
Anything in particular, or do you want me to send you the whole thing?
If you could send me the whole thing,
Yeah.
and then we can, I'm sure a couple of us could talk offline and review some of that stuff and see if there's anything useful.
Yeah, I'll just forward you that. same
But I also
email.
imagine that there's information in those studies that we could pair with the school district information. I would like to look more closely at the actual, like I thought that we were losing about 3% of our student body every year just to them aging out, but I'm sure that we could look at attendance data and possibly demographic data a little bit more closely to try and understand how that couples with the information the city has.
At
So-
one point, I think the district, I think Derek Spellman was doing it, was interviewing or surveying people that had school choice out of the district. I don't know
Yeah.
if there's any data available
There-
or.
There is, Tim was talking about that.
I think it'd be nice, I think it'd also be nice to include some teachers in this thing too, maybe from, because I think that they probably have their thumb on a lot of issues.
Yeah, I foresee, once we get the survey done, talking to staff, and then also some of the working groups. You know,
Yeah.
there's a pretty large group of parents that are involved with the
Yep.
schools, and I think that would be a good resource.
Yeah, we have active Working for Kids groups at least all of our elementary schools, and they are very active parents in the community, so I'm sure that
You
will.
have PTOs too, right?
That's what
basically what they
they've
are.
changed their names
Okay.
now to Working for Kids.
I'll send you, Joe, the WIDA study, which looks at things like median household income,
that'd be
things like that.
fantastic.
And, I mean, I think that alone would be interesting, median household income versus housing prices, and
absolutely.
is there a disconnect there?
Yeah.
But that is updated yearly too, so.
And since Matthew mentioned the jobs available in the local community, I know that, Randy, you mentioned that that's not necessarily a driving factor for attracting young people to communities like ours, but I would be interested, does the chamber track any history of jobs in the area, or, okay?
No, I have like a handle on the top 10 employers, that kind of thing, but even there, I don't even have like wage information.
Okay.
But
I
this
wonder-
study from WIDA kind of looks at bigger pictures.
I wonder if we could, speak somehow with some of those larger employers, just to figure out if they know anything about, just generally, what kind of people are working for them, and whether or not they live in Stoughton, and,
We're one
He
of them.
sent me some stuff.
oh, the district, yeah, the school district's the biggest one.
I appreciated your comments too about the fact that, there's a different way that people long in tooth like myself and the younger generation communicate. And I think that like Facebook and Twitter and the various blogs and all that kind of thing are something that we need to keep communicating. If we're gonna communicate with the people we're talking about, I think it's probably in a different way than we necessarily communicate with them right now. so I appreciate what you talked about.
I totally agree with you. If anything, videos. Sorry, but videos are going to be the most important things if you're going to promote your business, promote anything of that nature. You want to promote Stoughton, Andrew Nussbaum. You had him from Travel Wisconsin. He should be one of the most important people that we should connect with right away to try to build any kind of video to get,
We had one a number of years ago, and it was a very interesting one. It was done by Coal Banker, but it was a number of interviews with younger people who had moved to Stoughton and why they did. And it was a video where you could actually see them talk, like, here's why we moved here. It's just a wonderful community, and it would show shots of like the walking parks, and it would show some of the older homes that were, just gorgeous older homes, and the river and those kind of things, and that they were very effective videos, but they have to look good. They have to be done, I think, in a kind of a professional way. But
Well,
that's in the future. I mean, that's something after this.
I would
think.
say, to Matt's point, something, I mean, in this case, even a more raw video, just being out there, you interview one person, you just post their one interview, and you just do a series of those, is better than trying to put some grand production together.
Maybe even, if we do interviews, maybe even do a few videos of the interviews that we're doing. I mean, it's something to consider anyway.
Well, yeah, I mean, just get out there and
I'd have to comb my
find
hair
these young
and
adults
everything.
and interview them and put that as
Yeah,
video
that might
out
have
there,
a.
testimonials about the school, about the community, why are they here? I was just thinking, there's 45 new staff members in the school, why did they choose to come work for Stoughton? Even though they don't live in Stoughton, why did they choose to come work and be a teacher, educator in Stoughton? Include them in this.
the community television show, or the community TV station. Why can't we use them? I mean, I don't know how that works.
I'm sure they're always looking for new programming.
But just in general, you can take it and you can put it online, I mean, but
Seriously, keep them busy. Trust me.
people's attention spans are short though, so you do a quick 2-minute video asking the 1 or 2 or 3 key questions, and then immediately get that out there, and people start seeing a series of those. You're gonna have more impact from that than you will putting some grand,
Don't forget, you only
well
have 7
edited.
seconds.
you really, yeah, right, really only have
Well,
7 seconds.
my thought is that if we want to do a report, that might be one thing, but if we want to do something kind of interesting report, it might be through what you're talking, like a video interviews with the people that we're talking to, or something like that, so we can keep them and maybe even use them and show them. And
Yeah, and then they get shared and.
when we try to convince things like, like a city councilor or a school board to do something, it might be interesting for them to see those kind of videos.
Start with businesses and work your way out.
Yeah.
It may require a little more work, a little more time, but it might be something to consider for our group anyway.
So maybe that's something we could talk about at the next meeting,
Yeah.
like a plan. and
Yeah,
at the time
communication
when we're
packaging.
doing some of these things where we can kind of park
Good.
on some of these ideas.
Let's have some fun.
Yeah.
Can I just say a couple things real quickly?
Yeah, Frank, go ahead.
First, I do want to caution members of the group about open meetings violations. That doesn't apply to you guys, but for us, we cannot, as a group, get together and start commenting on each other's Facebook feeds, because at some point, we are violating the law by having a public meeting that is not properly noticed. It's insane, I'll explain it to you offline.
Okay.
But it doesn't apply to you guys, y'all say and do whatever you want. But I just want to remind the rest of this group to be careful. Secondly, I think that I would like to set a deadline for this group to come up with an action plan. I would like, speaking for myself, I would like by next May to have a list of things that we are going to do, the order that we are going to do them in, and who's going to be responsible for them. Whether it's the school district, whether it's the city, whether it's the chamber, whether it's somebody else. I recognize the deadline is tight. I think a little pressure is not the worst
Yeah,
thing in the
we can
world.
Put that on the next agenda so we
Yeah.
can take action on it.
Let's send that back to
Yeah.
both of the bodies and we'll have them discuss and feel like, or let us know what timeline is appropriate for each of them.
And then one of my intentions is to keep our council informed about what we're doing, and I think that really helps a lot, it just generates, I think, a understanding that something's coming and that kind of thing, and I think it's important for both, I'm not gonna talk for the school board, but I think for us to make sure that our council knows that we're active and moving forward.
I think that's one of the roles of having the co-chairs, so I would think that they would do that.
You guys have a Facebook page alone that just has
The city,
city.
we're in the
with-
process of jumping through the legal flaming hoop in order to get it done.
Okay.
Important thing is to pay your lawyers,
I was just
pay
wondering,
them well.
because in that way you guys could have a community spot.
We're
to-
working on a policy so we can do that, but it's not as easy as you might think for public records and things like that, but those are good ideas.
Oh, I guess because it's all closed doors. You'd have to have an open door.
Well, we have to retain records for permanently on that stuff, so we have to subscribe to a company to do that, and then there's rules that we have to have, and we're trying to
Staff
establish.
time about who, if somebody makes a bad comment that.
Yeah. Can we delete it, or is it in violation of free speech if we delete a comment on a public site? Things like that. It's really complicated.
We're not elected
No,
officials.
but we wanna go there.
So, I think we
I
have
so move.
a list of actions, a movement to, or a motion to adjourn.
Is that what that was?
Frank, I don't think you can move.
Oh,
You're not a voting member.
That was Sid.
So there is one point on the agenda items, though, we talked about having Mindy do a thing, was that for the future agenda?
Nicole is going to
I
speak
have a
with
call
her
in
this
for her,
week.
she's out this week, so
Okay.
she'll probably get
Okay.
back to me next week. And
I
then-
just wanted to touch that because it is
Yep.
on our agenda tonight.
Yep.
I'm happy I came.
Mindy is somebody who might help us do a
You work with
Get
me,
together.
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Get together and.
Unless you wanna come out with her.
Motion from a voting member to adjourn?
I move to adjourn.
Second?
Second.
Thank you. This meeting of the ad
Gotta
hoc committee
vote, gotta vote.
is adjourned.
Gotta vote.
All in
That's a
favor?
Oh, all in favor? Wow. Say
Aye.
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 Any
Any
opposed?
abstentions?
Nay. No.
Yeah. All right.
Stay safe.
Motion carries. One no.
Get it?
It's in-